David. David, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
How's Black Hat so far?
I can't complain. I just got settled in, so.
Yeah.
Same. It's a little hectic, but it's always great to run into people that you've seen in the past, and kind of just ideate about what's happening in the industry.
Agree. And it doesn't burn you out, or does it?
By the time it's time to leave Las Vegas, I'll be tired.
Well, Las Vegas can burn you out. That's a different topic. But for the sake of this conversation, let's do David and Dave, if that's okay.
Sure.
Both of you bring vast experience as security practitioners, professionals, and in the financial sector specifically. We're very proud to have you here. Dave, CISO at Robinhood, and David, CISO at GSR. Do you mind telling us how you went about starting your path as a CISO? What brought you to where you're at right now?
Yeah, I'd say for me, it was I got into it by accident. Started, with the Big Four, joined in the technology practice, and then about that time, I'd say Sarbanes-Oxley, a bunch of other things started coming out, and started becoming at least clear in my head that traditional technology was becoming commoditized, and security started looking like an interesting route. So that's when I started going into that, and I've been a CISO probably for over 15 years now.
Impressive. Do you mind sharing? That's actually a good segue. What is a CISO? I mean, the definition kind of varies as the years go by. What to you is a CISO?
So I think it's definitely evolved over time. Now it's more about not only having the technology skills, but I'd also say you really have to have the business acumen as far as whatever industry you're in, you really better understand it, because now it's about helping enable the business, where traditionally we have a reputation of telling everybody, no, you can't do that. It's important for business to get done. So it's really about how well do you understand the business, how well do you understand the risk, and can you work with the key stakeholders to come up with what's the right security solution and what's the right risk level for that business now. So it kind of requires both, I'd say, technical skills as well as business acumen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree 100% with David. I think there's two archetypes of CISOs. I think we're still early stages in figuring out what does a CISO actually mean. And I think a lot of organizations will take a director of security and say, poof, you're now the CISO because we need a CISO from a regulatory purpose. But I think a real CISO is somebody, to David's point, that partners with the business and understands their role within the organization is to not only safeguard the business, but to support the business. Mm-hmm. It's supporting the business from a velocity perspective. It's supporting the business from understanding and evaluating risk. Our job isn't to sit at the top of the mountain and shout edicts to say, you can do this or you can't do this. If the business says this is what we want to do, and we work with the business to make sure that they do it in a safe and secure manner.
Love that. Velocity is not to be underrated when we talk about security. So that's definitely interesting. David, what does it really take to succeed as a CISO, specifically within the financial sector?
So I'd say now it takes, especially within crypto, a good understanding of finance in general. My role's kind of evolved from not just managing security, privacy, but really within the crypto space and managing digital assets. Security is integral to every transaction. So I have to understand, what are the traders doing on a daily basis? How are they changing their strategies? Are we going into any new kind of DeFi markets or derivatives? So I'd say it takes a really good cross-section of how do I understand the business? How do I know that, okay, are we going to be doing gamma, or are we going to do alpha, delta hedging, or things like that? Of how does it change the security strategy? Because these are digital assets, so now it's really expected that they're like bearer bonds. Once they're gone, they're gone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think for me, I think it's there's two types of there's two ways you think about securing an organization. There's the low-hanging fruit that is the same for every organization. You're going to do, email security, and you're going to do, endpoint security. Those things don't really vary from industry to industry. You might have different levels of stringency of the controls in some respect. But I think the understanding from a financial market perspective, understanding how the financial markets work, how clearing and settlement works, when you're trading equities or you're doing collateralization, I think you have to understand how that works, because when we are securing our products and securing our services, there's intricacies that don't necessarily get solved from your traditional SAS scanning or your DAS scanning or your different security tooling. Understanding how the products work together, how the interoperability with different vendors. It's incredibly important to understand the business that you're supporting.
And today's point, I think, we're in highly regulated industries, so if you don't understand how the business works, you can't really work with the regulators, you can't really apply the right controls. So you really have to be embedded in the business.
Yeah, and the regulatory thing is absolutely key. It's there are multifaceted, different types of requirements from the different regulators, whether it's, state banking or, dealing with the OCC, the FDIC, if you're dealing with FINRA. So they all have, their different set of either, principle-based controls or very prescriptive controls. So, being in the financial market or financial services industry for the last 30 some odd years, you just get kind of accustomed to, what are the regulators looking for? So you can be a little bit forward-looking as you're building out your program.
Got it. What role does, obviously you mentioned a variety of use cases and tools that one would consider as a financial sector CISO. What role does cloud play, and how has that evolved in the past years, let's say 3 to 5 years?
So for us, we're 100% cloud and SaaS, so we don't do anything on-prem anymore, which means everything from our back office operations to trading, everything runs in cloud. So that's really just changed the perspective of now focusing on how do you do infrastructure as code? How do you really secure it? And really, how do you avail yourself of all the different components that you need? Because each cloud service provider will give you what they have and what you need to be compliant, but how do you apply it? How do you look for the right providers externally to augment those controls and make sure you have comprehensive coverage? I think that's a big challenge. Cloud's been strategically advantageous for us of how we operate, but it's really looking at now, instead of having everything controlled in on-prem, all of a sudden I have 80 plus SaaS tools, I have multiple cloud service providers, so it's really looking at how do I integrate seamlessly across all of this and still maintain my controls.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think cloud, it's very hard pressed to find an organization where purely on-prem makes sense. I think cloud, from a composability perspective, the ability to quickly scale up, scale down, there's definitely a cost savings in some respect, or at least being more pragmatic from a cost perspective, from a resiliency perspective, multi-cloud strategy for resiliency. So I think in this day and age, I think like I said, you'd be hard pressed to find an organization that is purely on-prem based. And if they are on-prem, it's really just more from a risk perspective to say, just in case there's any sort of cloud outages. But I think cloud is definitely something that is an integral part of any organization's strategy.
And I would just add to that, as a former regulator for the Federal Reserve, when you look at things like the FFIEC joint statement on cloud and other documents that we had created, I'd say there's an expectation that organizations are moving to cloud, and at least as a former regulator, I look at it from the perspective of that you can outsource anything, but you can't outsource your accountability. So you still have to exercise the appropriate judgment as you avail yourself of these new technologies.
Yeah, and that's a great point. With the cloud, you're not outsourcing your responsibility. You're not outsourcing risk. You're effectively buying compute. You're buying cloud instances and services, but you still maintain the ability from a security perspective to ensure that you're layering on those proper security controls.
I heard some great sound bites there, and as a marketer, I love that. So David, security is often considered or viewed as a cost center, whether we like it or not. How do you personally demonstrate ROI, and specifically for your cloud security investments?
That's a great question. So being in financial services, I think it's a little bit easier from the perspective now of I'm embedded with essentially trading operations and the rest of the operations. So as I look to bring on new technology, I look at how is it going to increase our throughput. In other words, I can only get through X amount of deals per day or pre-screening certain things within DeFi. So as I bring on the new technologies and things like that, I look at, how is it going to increase our deal flow? If I can currently only get through 20 or 30 prospective transactions from a security perspective per day, now with automation and other tooling that I've been bringing in, now I've been able to double or triple that number. That makes a lot of sense as far as the ROI to the business, because it increases our pipeline, increases our deal flow. So it's similar as I look at other aspects of cloud as well. Am I making sure that I'm decreasing latency? Am I making sure that I'm decreasing at least the perceived security overhead so we can continue to move faster? And those things really result in direct contributions to the bottom line. The more deal flow that we can do, the more transactions, that adds directly to our bottom line.
Was that something you needed to kind of educate internally on, or that you had to build and strategize together, or was it kind of intuitive?
So I think after being embedded with the business operations, with trading and things like that, you start looking at, okay, how are these things working? What is my part in it, and how is cloud operating overall? And what tools are available to help kind of improve the deal flow and improve our response time from a security perspective, knowing that they rely on us within, if I can get things down from a day or two response to the same day, and it increases our deal flow, adds directly to the bottom line. So I think that was easy to measure once you start thinking about how the transactions are done.
Dave, I want to tackle you with kind of a tricky question. So within cybersecurity, we all recognize risks to some degree and of different sorts. What is one risk that you deliberately chose to kind of, I don't know if accept is the right word, but and no worries, like no information to attackers, or we're at Black Hat, but your secret stays with us?
Sure, absolutely. I wouldn't say there's one particular risk, and I think it's a great question, because I don't think that we view our jobs as binary. There's no good security and bad security. Everything is on a spectrum in some respect. So I think our role as a CISO is to educate the business and help them understand where the risks are, and whether or not this is something that we as an organization feel comfortable, whether we've mitigated it completely, whether whether we've built perhaps not as much preventative controls but more detective controls, so we can respond to a particular incident. So I wouldn't say there's one particular risk that I feel that we've just accepted on. I think it's a collaborative conversation with the business to say, here's our business, here's what we're planning on shipping, and then from a velocity perspective, how does security help enable the business?
And I'm assuming it's dynamic as well. It changes over time.
Of course, as threat actors change their tactics, there might be something that maybe we felt comfortable with, but maybe now we don't feel comfortable with. So it's always this iterative improvement of a security program as well.
Yeah, and I can definitely add that, being in crypto, especially in DeFi, from that perspective of not just looking at is the business logic of the smart contract okay? Is the security logic of the smart contract okay? But looking at it from the perspective of kind of coming up with confidence intervals around the risk that's related around these contracts. They're not all that secure in some cases, and some have higher risk than the others. But part of our job is understanding the risk appetite of the organization, bringing an accurate risk picture to the business. So I'm not saying, no, you can't do these transactions. I'm giving them the accurate picture of what's the risk involved around certain smart contracts or certain DeFi operations that we may want to engage with, and then they can make an informed judgment on, is the reward worth the risk?
It's a weird world, right? If you're doing your job, nobody knows that you're there because the organization is secure. And then if something bad happens, you get fired. So it is somewhat of like this weird, thankless kind of like environment.
So looking ahead, how do you show that security is making progress?
Yeah, it's difficult, right? It's you always look at security program of how do you enhance it, how do you improve it. So there's always this. What you did last year is not good enough for next year because the threat actors are always changing their tactic. To demonstrate value, I think it's really demonstrating that you are addressing the risk to the organization, that you're staying on top of the new, TTPs that the threat actors are using to try to, do the bad things. But at the end of the day, it is difficult. It's, how do you measure ROI? We don't get hacked. If you don't get hacked, you're doing a good job, and nobody knows that you're there. You're transparent to the business. You're enabling the business. You're out of their way. It's as frictionless as possible. You want to create an environment in which engineers can build and product people can design, and the business can operate without security. Creating that friction.
Do you feel like a hero, like that cliche of not all heroes wear capes? I know it's kind of weird, but it's you kind of touched on that in a way.
Yeah, I mean, especially in financial services, like we're the stewards of people's, net worth. So I think for, in financial services, I mean, outside of, healthcare, which is people's lives, this is, again, very, very similar in some respect of, people being able to take care of their families and, generations. So it's, it's tough, yeah.
Yeah. David, how do you measure, or what key cloud security matrix do you follow to show impact?
So that's always challenging. I think we always look at the same kind of standards of what's the uptime mean, but I always look for things that are what's meaningful to the business, because we can measure uptime, we can measure things that have been blocked, but it's more about measuring, I'd say, improvements to the business, kind of the transaction flow, reduction in latency. I think those things have a direct correlation, because to Dave's point is if we're doing our jobs for better or worse, we kind of look like a utility company where everything is good, and nobody knows you're there until the lights go out, and then it's a problem. So part of that is it's always hard to demonstrate metrics because they're so subjective to the organization. I think the security metrics that are kind of generating value have to really be aligned with what industry you're in, what business are you in, and how are you improving the contributing to the bottom line.
Has for both of you, I'd say, has your security strategy impacted your product, the product you work with, in any sort of way, and how so?
So for us, it definitely has. I'd say we've increased our deal flow, brought in automation where things that would take 3 days to analyze are down to less than a day, and that makes a significant improvement into do we invest in this or not? Because when you look at new deals, oftentimes you have a limited window to take advantage of it, and since it's DeFi, a lot of it is still kind of regulated but not fully regulated. So there's no corporate structure to look at. There's not necessarily liquidity to look at as far as who do you hold responsible if something goes wrong with that contract. So a lot of it has to do directly with the business logic and security logic of the contract. So anything we can do to decrease the window of time to either approve things or paint a better risk picture for the business increases their bottom line.
Love it. What about you, Dave?
And I love the question because I think there's security for the organization, and then I think what you touched on is also somewhat of like product security. When clients are using different technologies and different products and services, they want to feel that it's safe and it's secure. We're entering in a world with social engineering and spear phishing, and customers in all industries getting account takeovers. So they want to work with organizations where they feel that the security is not just protecting themselves but also protecting them as well.
It's an inherent part of the organization and culture.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's talk about runtime for a second. Is that an overhyped word, or is it an actual necessity that has grown in recent years? And what's your personal take on it, Dave?
Actually, for me, it makes a big difference, essentially, because when you're testing things versus static analysis versus runtime, it can perform very differently, especially if it's under a significant pressure from a volume perspective. So for me, runtime still makes a difference.
Yeah, I think for me, the way I would sum it up is it's the difference between theoretical and practical. We want to work on the things and address the things that actually truly matter, and runtime is where the exploits are actually taking place. So I think runtime is more than a buzzword.
I tend to agree, but I'm obviously not objective. So, Dave, one of the largest enablers, and specifically within the financial sector, is compliance. Everyone is afraid of auditors, apparently. Is that a thing? Can you elaborate a little bit on this, and how do you cope?
Yeah, I don't take that approach, honestly. I actually work really, really hard to develop a meaningful relationship with the regulators. Their job is to, ensure the safety and soundness of financial markets and to protect individuals. But I think that there's this misunderstanding in the industry that auditors are out to get you and regulators are out to get you. So there's a wall that's tend to be put up, and I'm sure when David talks, as a former regulator, I'm sure he's felt it, where they're not brought into the conversation. I take the opposite approach. For me, regulators have the experience of working with all of the peers, working with large, globally systemic important banks, and really understanding where the market is headed. What are the new tools in place? So I actually learn from my regulators and I embrace it, but it is a thing.
What about you, Dave?
So I'd say building that kind of team relationship is very important. And as a former regulator, things that we would look for also would be self-disclosure. So nobody, as a former regulator, nobody ever gets an A+. Nobody. It's just not how the world works. On a good day, you'll get observations. On a bad day, you'll get other more significant findings. But I think part of it is we don't necessarily expect perfection, because again, security is always a work in progress. But self-disclosures go a long way, because if you're self-disclosing, whether it's stuff to audit, internal audit or external audit, to the regulators, that means it shows certain awareness of your environment. I also expect you to have a plan to fix it, so don't just tell me everything is a mess and we have no plans. That's a different story. But if you self-disclose, it also shows a certain awareness of your environment and that you're working to actively improve it. Because then if we come in as a regulator or an auditor or things like that and we find it, then we wonder, why didn't you disclose it? And that kind of sheds additional questions on the relationship of, did you not have enough awareness of your environment, or were you hoping that we didn't find it? And either way, it brings a different level of scrutiny, because everybody has room for improvement. So the question is, if you declare it and have a plan around it, it's generally perceived much better than if we have to turn something up ourselves.
Yeah, it's much better to have a defensible, position to David's point, to say, we've already identified this. Here's our corrective action plan. Here's the evidence as to why we made this decision or not made this decision. As opposed to just crossing your fingers and hoping, shielding the auditors and maybe not providing, all of the requested deliverables and intentionally. So again, it's what David said, 100%.
Dave, can you share an experience where there's been a paradigm shift in security architecture?
Sure, and I'm sure David will love to talk about this as well. In the crypto world, multi-party computation, I think, is something that is really accelerated the way we look at key management. What multi-party computation brings to the table is, the ability to have, by design, multi-signatures to a transaction.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Dave. You look at it from the perspective of now, when you think of like traditional wallets or things like that, where a transaction is done almost instantly by one signature. Since we're in finance, you need the ability to have multiple signers, multiple different levels of authority and approval. So that's helped really transition our industry and make it more secure by distributing those keys and being able to kind of distribute authority across the organization as well.
Yeah, and just like layering in those business policies into it as well. So, a transaction up to X requires this, or a transaction over here or to this address requires these different set of signatures. All of that could be built into the protocol.
Yeah, and it also goes a long way for recoverability too, because when you think about how to do recoverability in crypto, you don't want one set of keys, controlling everything. You want to be able to kind of distribute that and have multiple people being able to say, okay, it takes 2 out of 4 or 3 out of 6 or however many to actually be able to recall those things in the event of emergency.
As we approach our end of the session, our end of the fireside chat, if you had to give one tip for a starting CISO, and specifically within the financial sector or fintech, what would it be? Dave, let's start with you.
Sure. I love the question, and I would say learn technology first. I think a lot of people that want to start a career in cybersecurity jumped to security. And as I'm a professor, and I see that all the time, the students are just, what's security certification? And they want to jump right into security. They are not gaining that fundamental understanding of the technology itself that they are securing, and without that underlying knowledge, they're not going to be successful in the security realm.
And what technology are we talking about? Is within IT, within anything within computer
any technology,
science?
Understanding how cloud works, like understanding how compute works, understanding when you're, going to a website, what's actually happening, understanding the OSI layer, just understanding all facets of technology, because then when you pivot towards, well, now that I understand how the technology works, understanding how to secure it is more intuitive than just to understand I have to throw a firewall or a data loss prevention or an MDM. If you don't understand what's actually happening under the hood, you're not going to be successful.
Thinking about it out loud, can you think of a technology practice that you wouldn't necessarily see CISOs or security practitioners evolving from, but would actually benefit them or us as an industry?
Yeah, I think coming from legal world, I think is an interesting. I happen to be an attorney. I wasn't an attorney first. I became attorney later on in my career. It's a very interesting connection between the two. As a lawyer, you have similar from a red teamer and from a blue teamer. If I am trying to, I don't want to use the word exploit, but if I'm trying to figure out how to do something, it's like finding vulnerabilities in the wording of the contract. Or conversely, if I'm trying to protect a client, and it's the way I craft the words, thinking about all the contingencies, about all the different things that could potentially happen. So there's a similarity between the two. So I think with the right archetype, I think lawyers could actually make very good CISOs.
Interesting. I've never thought of that. That's something for me to think about. David, what about you?
Adding to what Dave said, I definitely agree as far as the backgrounds where everyone can come from, as I've reported to CLOs, I've reported to CEOs, reported to CTOs as well. And I think, if you're a new CISO coming in, not only have a good understanding of the business that you're joining, but to Dave's point, I'd say, understand the fundamentals of security hygiene, because there's so many tools, there's so many advanced things that are out there that a lot of times you get distracted with, let me bring certain tools in, where you really need to understand what are this basic security hygiene, whether you're starting with like NIST CSF or things like that, of 70% probably of the incidents and breaches that we see go back to just poor, I'd say basic cybersecurity hygiene. So it's really, make sure you have a good foundation first, and then start looking for, what kind of tools are going to help you enhance that and augment it. But a lot of the fundamental failures come from just overlooking some of the basic blocking and tackling.
That makes sense. David, if you were not a CISO, what would you be?
That's a really good question. I'm also very academically minded, like Dave is as well. So I am an adjunct faculty for Harvard, and I also have a somewhat of a background in law too. So would it be a toss-up? Do I go academia or do I go legal? It'd be somewhere between those two.
Dave, what about you?
Yeah, I think I love building. So if I had to pivot outside of security, I guess it would be back into pure technology, which I've done before. I haven't always been in security. I love the law, so I might end up practicing, or as David mentioned, academia. I love being a professor. I love teaching.
Thank you both so much for being here today.
Thanks.
Thanks.